They said, yeah, yeah. I went online and I pretended that I had my own botnet, and I just wound up, they had got stolen mine by accident, and so I started, a discussion with them and see if we could join forces. And I tried to get some information out of them, and I'm like, well, you didn't actually get their real names or where they lived or anything. And he said, yeah, I did. Like I got a real IP address, and then one screwed up, and I got his actual name. I was like,
it's Peter Coroneos here from the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, and I'm here with author and friend Joesph Menn, who's the author of this iconic book, Fatal System Error, which was published in, I think it was 2010 is
that's
when
right.
it came out. And so, Joe, what sort of prompted me to talk to you today was we'd been tracking the Colonial pipeline hack, and one of the big takeouts was the fact that it was evidently a Russian criminal organization that was behind the attack. And we then saw calls from Joseph Biden and the G7 when they met in England shortly thereafter, a call to other nation states to rein in their criminal organizations because of this continual thing that was so central to this book, and that was governments protecting bad actors within their own jurisdiction for reasons that we can come to. And so I thought, well, nothing much has changed. I better call Joe and let's do a 11-year redux on the book itself, and see, what your take is on, why things haven't changed. In February 2011, we had the final gala dinner for my tenure as the chief executive of the Internet Industry Association. And that afternoon, you'd been with us, and we'd done a roundtable with some senior government officials and industry people. And we'd been talking about the book, and you'd made the comment,
the bad guys do capitalism better than we do.
And I remember that stuck with me, and everyone was sort of, it's sort of one of those comments that someone makes and you think about it for a minute, and then you think, now that I think about it, it's absolutely true. So I then go on to describe the book itself, and I said, true to our word, we're delighted to enclose your complimentary copy of Fatal System Error. If you didn't know it was true, you'd swear it was fiction. So I'm going to sort of pass over to you now. Just one other thing, and that was the next paragraph. I had the pleasure of meeting the two main characters, Barrett, Lyon, and Andy Crocker, last year. It was slightly surreal. You never think such mild-mannered guys would have the gumption and the skill to take on the Russian business network and the persistence to deliver the first ever convictions and imprisonment. So I was just relating to Joe before the call. I was at a conference in Los Angeles in late 2010, and Barrett and Andy show up in the lobby, and I'd never met them before. And somehow we got talking, and I realized these were the two central characters in your book. And I had the most surreal experience. It was like meeting Alice and the White Rabbit. That you think these are fictional characters that couldn't possibly exist, and there they are right in front of you talking to you. And I'm at a loss to even ask them some sort of sensible question. In the end, I said something like, did Joe get it right? Was it like he said in the book? And they said, absolutely. In fact, they said there was more that he didn't talk about. So that's a long introduction, but I just wanted to give people a bit of context around how we met, and also the book and the characters. And now I'd like you, if you would, to just run through the plot high level. I mean, these two characters that were so central to the book itself, what the story actually was, what the outcome was. And then I think we should have a discussion about what, if anything, has changed 11 years
Sure.
later.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's good to see you, and appreciate. It was my only trip to Australia, and I had a wonderful time. So really appreciate your invitation at the time. Right. So just to set the stage a little bit, at the time I'd been covering cybersecurity for several years at the Los Angeles Times, based up in San Francisco, and it was frustrating back then because it was super important, but there wasn't it was still obscure to most people, even people in positions of power in government, legislature, CEOs of ordinary companies sort of have this, it's sort of this annoying thing, and they think that just, buying an off the shelf antivirus is going to fix the problem. And what I saw was that it was bad, and it was going to get worse because all the incentives were wrong. There was, and it was accelerating with the introduction of organized crime. So that happened in around 03, 04. And it's a terrible thing for the world, but it made my job of explaining that this was a big deal much easier. The initial round were spammers. They needed clean IP addresses, clean email addresses to send their spam to because the blacklists were getting better. And so they hired virus writers that created the first botnets, so they could send stuff from your grandmother's, unused computer when she was sleeping. That even I saw that as the beginning of really serious problems. But what happened after they had these botnets was sort of even much more of a grabber for regular people, because the second easiest thing you can do besides relaying spam is do denial of service attacks. And so there came this wave of denial of service attacks against websites. And the pitch was pretty simple. Your website's going to stay down unless you send $20,000 by Western Union at the time, or one of the other services. And then it was divided up by money mules, and so as many hops before you got to the real bad guy. And this isn't like technically super sophisticated. This is not the space age 0 day from the genius. In his mom's basement. What it is a devastating combination of an effective business model, the lack of the difficulty in defending the networks, at least initially, and the blasé attitude of the authorities in the countries where the bad guys were operating. While I was working at the LA Times, I was sort of looking for a way to tell the broader story, which is complicated but important. I get a pitch. I think I got a pitch from this small company I hadn't heard of that said that this guy had defended some gambling websites from denial of service attacks, and he's got kind of a story to tell. And I'm like, okay, sure. I'm interested in the area in general. I think this is like a vehicle to tell the broader story. So I'll meet the guy. And it was one of the most remarkable interviews of my whole life. I mean, Barrett walks in, he's wearing shorts and flip-flops in my office in San Francisco. He's like maybe in his mid-20s. It just seems like a goofy kid. And he says like, so I say, so you defended these companies against these denial of service attackers? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, did you learn anything about the attackers? And this is, and he gave me a technical explanation first of, how he added the bandwidth and so forth. And I said, well, did you happen to learn anything about the attackers? And this is where the conversation usually ends with any sort of defender, because the answer is no. I mean, their job is to make the attack go away. And maybe some super sophisticated threat researcher will have a guess as to what country they're from, or can tie it to some known group. But this is a long time ago. This is like 04, 05. And he says, yeah, I chatted with them. I said, what? He said, yeah. I went online and I pretended that I had my own botnet, and I just wound up, they had got stolen mine by accident. And so I started, a discussion with them and see if we could join forces. And I tried to get some information out of them. And I'm like, well, you didn't actually get their real names or where they lived or anything. And he said, yeah, I did. Like I got a real IP address, and then one screwed up and I got his actual name. I was like, holy cow. And it just got better and better. It's like, you don't have any like transcripts or anything, do you? And he's like, yeah, here they are. I couldn't believe it. It was like the best, like sort of spy cops and robbers story. I'd ever read in cybersecurity. Maybe the Mitnick chase around the globe sort of thing, but it was pretty good and much more sort of current about what the real problems are and this sort of the uncatchability of these business heads, in this case in Russia. So I wrote a front page LA Times story about this, and one of the like the real questions was like, why were they, that a lot of people had, is like, why, they wound up doing this to a lot of the industry and to a lot of different websites, but why would you start with a gambling website in Costa Rica? Why would you attack them? And there are a few reasons for that. Actually, one is they deal in cash. Another is they cannot go down on, say, Super Bowl Sunday, because there's a million other websites doing the same thing that the viewer can just hop to. The third thing is they don't have the greatest, most solid infrastructure in the world, because they're in Costa Rica. And the last reason is they're not going to go to the FBI. And the reason is that the FBI doesn't think very highly of offshore gambling sites catering to U.S. consumers. And in fact, they consider those folks to be lawbreakers. So they're not going to go help them. So that's why. So I wrote that story, and I stayed in touch with Barrett because he's a great guy and he knows stuff. And we're both in San Francisco. And then a couple of years go by, and I'm thinking about how to do a book, because I think this is complicated, important, but I'm looking for like the hook that once again is like something that's so simple that even members of Congress will follow it. This isn't going to be shown in the U.S., is it? I
would say that statement's generalizable everywhere, but what would I know?
And Barrett calls me one day and he says, I got to tell you something. Off the record, you can't use this unless we come to some sort of agreement later. But you remember how you were suspicious of the guys whose websites I was defending, and you thought that maybe that they were kind of shady. Well, they were Gambinos.
Wow.
And after we spoke, they bankrolled my new company. I went off on my own to do a DDoS defense company. They were the key investors, and I guess it was
I don't remember that part. That just added another whole dimension.
Well, that's when I knew I had a book.
Yeah,
that's when I knew I had a book.
Yeah.
Because this guy deliberately infiltrated the Russian cyber mob, accidentally infiltrated the American cyber mob, and walked away. And it's like, this is a movie, So anyway, apparently a turning point, we spent a lot of time talking about this. A key turning point was when he had to make payroll from his investors, and he was told to go meet a guy in a parking lot who had a briefcase full of cash. And obviously he should have figured this out earlier. But that was pretty much a gimme at that point.
Boy, I hope he kept his investors happy.
Well, as you know, Barrett is an interesting guy. And I think a normal person at this point would have said, this is really, it's been a great run, and I'm just going to resign and pursue other interests.
Yeah.
But instead, he went back to the FBI, who had blown off his earlier complaint about the Russians, all the evidence that he'd given me, and said, well, I think you might be interested in my investors. And so he continued to work there, and he wore a wire against the Gambinos.
Whoa.
And not only that, he outed himself as an informant to me. He never had to testify in trial because everybody pled, the guys that they could catch anyway. And he outed himself to me for the book as an informant for what he knew was a subplot, because he knew that more people would read the book and therefore learn about how bad cybersecurity is and why this needed to be an issue addressed at the White House level. So so I'm working along, and then in the middle of this, so that's Barrett. And in the middle of this, I got a book deal, I'm working on it. And in the middle of it, the guy in England who was his partner, Andy Crocker, retires. And he retires mad, because he'd worked for the National High-Tech Crime Unit, which was one of the very best national cybercrime fighting agencies in the UK. And they had sent him to Russia to pursue these same bad guys, because the same group of extortionists had been hitting publicly traded, legitimate UK gambling sites. And they, Her Majesty's government wanted to draw a line and said, no, you can't attack our businesses, no matter where you are. And so it was going to be a test case. And I can't remember who it was. It was Jack Straw, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time, had to call his equivalent in Russia and say, look, we really want cooperation on this case. And this was before Litvinenko, and there was kind of a detente between the UK and Russia right then. And they said, okay. And so Andy had gone over there, and it was a miraculous case. He spent 3 years, most of it in Russia. They had to find Russian laws that these guys had broken, and because there's no extradition, so they had to be prosecuted in Russia for attacks on Russians.
Yeah. And
so he worked with the MVD, and it was like incredible. They at one point there was a plot to kill Andy because one of the bad guys turned out that they were going to arrest turned out to be the son of the local police chief. And there were dramatic twists and turns. And then he comes, so they get the three guys get arrested, the three guys get convicted despite the judge being offered $1 million bribe. They get sent to jail, which, happens never.
Never happens.
Russia. Never happens. And then he comes back and these three guys are mid-level guys. They are not the super genius heads of the Russian business network who are connected out the wazoo. Mm-hmm. But still, it's pretty impressive. And Andy rightly, understandably thought that there would be a pretty big news story about it in the UK, that there would be a press release or whatever. But the NHTCU had been taken over by an ex-spy. And he's like, no, we're an intelligence agency. We don't talk about what we do. So meanwhile, it's news in Russia. Russia is writing about this case. The MVD is proud because they actually, they work with, and it helps dispel the myth of them all being cahoots with the mobsters. And there's no coverage in the UK. So Andy quits. And there's I got this whole back half of the book to tell you. And so the book actually winds up being the Barrett half and then Andy's half. And then there's an end where I talk about the policy implications of all this and what Congress and the White House should do. So that is the book in a nutshell.
That's this plot. And I remember there's some really funny parts in there where he goes out with the MVB chief of police and they get him drunk. And he's so drunk on vodka.
Well, there's a number of incidents like that.
I mean, that's not unique, but I just thought in the context of the story, it just added so much color. I mean, there's a lot of color in this book, just
there's some pulse pounding, scary stuff.
And the other part,
it's got hookers and guns and stuff for the common man. You don't have to be a cyber whiz to appreciate it, but the people who appreciate it more than anybody are people who work in security, because most of them never hear about a case that goes to the end.
Yeah.
But and there's a happy conclusion to it, except there's a twist where Andy wanted to go higher up the chain, and the FSB said, no, time to leave the country now. You're done, because it was just then that the intelligence agencies were working at a high level with these mobsters to join forces against Georgia, Ukraine, and others like that. And that's, it was kind of an inflection point. It was right as that was beginning to take off.
So I remember now that when I was talking to Andy in the lobby of that hotel, and Barrett was standing right there, and I think they both agreed. I think I said something like, how is it that these guys are tolerated? I mean, Russia's coming under international pressure, even back then, certainly now. How is it they're tolerated, these guys? And they said something which was shocking to me, but I suppose on reflection makes sense as well, that they're considered an asset that could be used for national purposes. And so they're tolerated, they're condoned, their activities on the proviso or on the understanding that if the need arises, that they can be called into the services of the government in a cyber offensive kind of situation. So they're basically a set of skills that are there, a reserved set of skills, basically.
Right. So, so that's the critical point, and that is the big sort of logical leap that takes a while for people to get to. I did not anticipate that when I started working on the book. I didn't know a lot about Russia, but what I learned is that they're sort of already halfway there because the corruption is so deep in many places in Russia that particularly in law enforcement and in the intelligence agencies, that it's kind of they started to come into contact. Well, they come into contact with regular businesses, like completely honest, above board businesses, pay police off for protection. And the bigger the business, the more you have to pay to somebody more important for protection. This is also true of criminal groups. And one of the things to understand there is that official public salaries are quite low. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of expected that people will have kind of a side business shaking people down. One sort of instance of this is that the lowest paying and least prestigious law enforcement job you can get in Moscow is traffic cop. But that's actually the most sought after job because that's the one that gives you the most opportunities to interface with your public and to shake down your public, which, so you get more money that way. So even the good cops are corrupt. And the questions are like, well, how important was that case, that they threw, and how much money did they get? So maybe that's enough that they don't have to keep doing it in other cases that might be more important. So once you understand like how bad it is and that the police are actually seeing cybercrime not as like a growing threat to society, but as a revenue stream.
Right.
Like there's competition between the FSB and the MVD for cyber cases because they both want the money from catching the guys who are making out like bandits. It doesn't mean that those bandits are going to spend very long in jail or maybe no jail. It's, if they are in jail, it's to try and, shake them down better. Like how much money will you give me to get out of jail? That's the dynamic. And then you throw in the national strategy issue. These guys have coding skills. They have server farms. They have programs that, are attack Trojans that will, work against Citibank, but will also work against, the Ukraine, Ministry of Defense. Right. So it is a two-step process, but you can see how it happens. And that is how it happened. And unfortunately, it's more true now. We actually had US indictments a year or two ago in the Yahoo case of people who were like both an established cyber criminal and an officer in the FSB at the same time, same guy. So it's more out in the open now than when I was doing my work on this subject. But these guys are more valuable. They have many more millions of dollars, and there's also deniability. That's the beauty part. Depending on what day of the week it is, whoever you're talking to in Russia who's in a position of power can say, yeah, we can't do anything. We can't do anything about those guys. They're patriots, or they're criminals. We can't catch them. Or how do you even know they're Russians? I mean, it's all happening back channel. So it's important that there are things like indictments, public naming and shaming. And what I think one of the things it will take is more of the publication of evidence like Mueller did in the special counsel's report about Russia's influence or attempt to influence the 2016 election. Yeah. Where they actually like, here are their names, here are their ranks, here's their chats. You're giving up some sources, maybe, definitely some methods. But if you're trying to change the world, you need evidence, and it needs to be public.
So, where to go with this? I mean, well, a few things that are obvious to observe is that the quantum of extortion, the amounts that they're extracting are increasing. So, if anything, Joe, I think these dynamics are amplifying. The combination, for instance, of extortion, data exfiltration on top of a ransomware attack. So you give them the double whammy, and they've got no option really but to comply, because even if they got backups, you've got their data. So it's going on the dark web if they don't pay you. So that, and they're doing that. And I guess Colonial Pipeline, that involved that as well, didn't it? They showed evidence that actually exfiltrated some company data, I think.
Right. And that was the reason that the company gave in the end for paying is,
Yeah. So what
so
else
I mean, so let's go back to the capitalism thing.
Yeah.
So one of the, besides the sort of the corruption and the strategic asset part, one of the reasons that this has persisted is that, the bad guys have this thriving economy. They work really hard and they diversify and they specialize. Like, just like Adam Smith said, there's one guy to like stretch the metal thing and another guy to like, chop it off to make the nail. There are guys who do nothing but write viruses. They're guys that rent out time on the botnets. They used to say that like porn drove innovation in tech, and that switched over to crime driving innovation quite a while ago. So it's the freemium model. Like you can have some of these get some of this attack software free, and if you really like it, then you can get the fancier version for a little bit of money, and so that markets it by itself. So the sort of, when you think about the double extortion that you were talking about, now it's not just your website goes away, of course. It's like, we're going to lock up all your machines. And then additionally, starting a few years ago, by an extremely well-connected ransomware gang, as it happens, called Maze, we're going to start publishing your files unless you pay. So it's like the double extortion thing. If you think of it like them, it's a line extension. It's a business line extension. It's like Heinz saying, well, we already have ketchup in the aisles. We're going to, in the US anyway, we're going to start making mustard as well. I mean, it's just sort of a logical business-minded way to approach it. So there's that. And then there's the twist where, in order to keep their government, I don't want to say sponsors, their government allies sweet, they train their stuff to look for words like, oh, I don't know, secret, top secret, COVID, sanctions, stuff that they know people have a special interest in. And if they won't pay extra for it, as long as they're exfiltrating this data, will be nonetheless be glad to receive it and be that much less likely to, issue demands, crackdowns, that sort of thing. So far, the US hasn't come up, and the G7 hasn't come up with any sort of equivalent value. And so that's the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, COVID then added another layer on top of all of that as well, with the exploitation of human behavioral weaknesses and emotional stress.
Well, so it was a field day for phishing. You got people click on stuff. They're also working from home and have worse security. It's much harder to monitor, all the traffic. In addition, there was another hacking incentive because the major powers were looking for information about infection rates and vaccine progress in particular. And then I think another big impact was the ransomware spreading to the hospitals. And this is just like the worst. This is the worst. I mean, there are people who've died now because ransomware froze up their hospitals. And you would have one ransomware group saying, oh, we're never going to do that. And some other one say, oh, we're happy to do that. As long as it's not in Russia or Ukraine or wherever else their host country was.
They set some parameters, but as you say, there's always someone. Keep going, Joe. I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you on that point, but I think I'd stopped you mid.
Well, so that's continued. It's clear that, I mean, there have been mixed reports in Russia and the US media about how well these ongoing talks are going between US and Russia, but there hasn't been any sustained retreat in the ransomware attacks. I'm not saying it's not possible. I think it is possible. I'm glad that the White House is engaged. I'm glad the allies are engaged. They are starting to do things around cryptocurrency, which is, the lifeblood of the thing. what's weird is that cryptocurrency has gotten so big that it is both necessary to throw on anti-money laundering and know your customer regs around it, and very, very hard to do it. Because you can do that to exchanges in America or the UK, but you can't do that to exchanges in Moscow, not without something else happening. So there's going to be more offensive hacking by the US and allies against those exchanges to try and get to the ransomware actors. But it's got to be everything all at once to have any hope of actually making progress. I'm actually more hopeful now than I have been in the past, because at least we're engaged now.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, I was actually I was surprised, but also pleased to see the G7 come out with at least that statement they made. And I think the hospitals thing has been interesting because it does start to draw a clearer line, a brighter line in the moral divide between what's acceptable and what isn't, even within the hacking community. But I want to come back to that in a minute. But the other thing, I was on a call, webinar last week with Sydney University. They'd put together an event, and we were talking about the geopolitical dimensions of all of this stuff. And I raised the G7 and colonial pipeline issue, and they were saying, well, you know, what do you think? And I said, well, frankly, from where I sit now here, I just don't see any incentive for foreign governments that are wanting to maintain a cyber offensive capability to rein in these criminal actors. I mean, where is the upside? Unless you can introduce, firstly, you need attribution. And your point about evidence, I think, is critical. But, you know, our other cyber experts tell us attribution's no easier now than it was before necessarily. It can be extremely difficult. So the whole prospect of even, you know, well, plausible deniability remains a fact of life amongst the host nation, let's call them. So, you know, unless you could bring to bear sanctions of some form or incentives, I don't know whether it's going to be a carrot or a stick thing or both. But I mean, there's clearly going to have to be some concerted dialogue, uniform, universal dialogue around this question of where is the is there a net gain for the global community and for each country as a global participant to have more effective, you know, prosecutorial investigative mechanisms where you can rein these guys in. So you've got to create a higher upside for nations to want to comply, to incentivize that. And I'm just not seeing it at the moment. But the other point I was thinking about the morality of this. Someone else asked me recently, you know, how is it that hackers can impose this kind of hardship and suffering on humanity and still sleep at night? Now, I don't know any hackers that are engaged in that kind of work, but it always struck me that one of the issues we've got is the disconnect between the action, essentially keystrokes on a keyboard at the hacker end, and the real death and destruction that you can create at the other end. And that disconnect creates like a moral separation where you're not actually encountering upfront and personal the effects of your actions. And I sometimes think whether we shouldn't be doing more to try and highlight the actual human cost, to see whether at least some proportion of the hacker community will start to think again about the way they're using their skills. I mean, I would accept that there are probably going to be some people that are beyond redemption here that just wouldn't care. There's got to be some that might reflect more if we could show them the face of the suffering that they're creating.
I think you would get some if there was some way to, you know, show the videos from the hospitals to a broader number of people. Yeah, you would peel away some of the hackers. But I feel like there are others that would take their place. I think they're often quite young, teenage, not fully developed morally.
Mm.
Um, and the money is really good. Um, and you also have a disinformation problem, could be accused of making it up. And then, there are a lot of people that, if you're, just putting myself in their mind, there are a few different things. One is like, yeah, but American healthcare is so horrible anyway and unfair and reserved for the rich that, you're letting countless babies die because there isn't competent prenatal care for poor people,
Mm-hmm.
which is true. Um, and therefore to punish that society, isn't so bad. You could also say that, look, Russia has got all kinds of suffering in it. There's many hungry people. And this is one thing we can do. And so let's level the playing field, and maybe we can get some, that's what I said. It's like a bargaining chip. It's like a
Moral
major,
self-justification. Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's true. I mean, look at the Korean situation, North Korea and shadow brokers, those guys that are actually almost effectively an arm of the government. I don't know if they're technically employed by the government, but they're certainly reaping in a lot of foreign exchange revenue to circumvent sort of sanctions that nations have attempted to impose.
Yeah, there's an interesting structure over there. What you have is there are some units of the military that are required basically to develop their own revenue. So that begets not only, crypto mining software and ransomware. But those guys sell meth. I mean, it's very different from the military in other countries. Go out, good luck, see what you can do. I mean, I actually think that WannaCry escaped from the lab. I don't think that was a well executed maneuver. I think that was a military project that escaped.
Yeah.
So, and it didn't bring them very much money. It was all incredible damage for not very much money at all.
I was surprised at that too. I really thought, as we were watching that unfold, I thought it was going to be a whole lot worse than it was. And I think even NotPetya, I mean, they killed that pretty fast as well. I think there was some poor configuration in the command and control servers or something that they were able to swap the domain or something and kill it. But I mean, if they wanted to, I mean, here's another sort of dimension now. Let's move to critical infrastructure, which Colonial Pipeline was sort of a little bit of a taste of that. We had it in Australia, actually. I think we qualify as one of the first jurisdictions in the world to have actually experienced a cyberkinetic attack in about 2001, 2002. And there was a guy that was doing contract work for one of the local government councils, and I think it was to do with the sewerage management process. Do you remember that story?
I know the story.
And I think they terminated his contract, and he felt cheated, and so he thought he'd pay them back by spilling, I don't know, 200,000 liters of raw sewage into the water supply. And I think he got away with a suspended prison sentence. But that was 20 years ago. I remember we were talking then about critical infrastructure attacks. And I'd gone to DC leading an industry delegation. It was the day of the Bali bombing. It was exactly 1 year and 1 day after 9/11. And I was in Washington in the FBI headquarters in their auditorium. And the discussion was about critical infrastructure protection. It was part of the bilaterals, US-Australia bilaterals. And Ronald Dick, I think might have been the deputy director, came in at the coffee break in the morning and said, I've got some bad news for our Australian colleagues here. There's been an attack in Bali and it seems like some of your people have perished. So there was a sort of really interesting, was all this surreal stuff that happens every time I go to the States. I went another time and walked past the Supreme Court, and Monica Lewinsky was giving evidence against Bill Clinton, and there was wall-to-wall media vans outside. And another time I was there, and I just switched on the TV. It was 11 p.m. I was ready to go to bed. I just thought, I'll see what's on the news. And Obama's standing there saying, we've just taken out Osama bin Laden. And I think I was there in with the Bush-Gore contest. I was there that week that America didn't have a government, a presumptive government. And Fidel Castro came in and offered to supervise a recount. I got to stop going to the States. It's like every time I go, something really crazy happens. But I mean, just returning to our conversation around critical infrastructure, I mean, we've got entire networks that are now online. Obviously, we've had the, industrial control SCADA type systems that have been around forever. They're usually unpatched. There's any number of them. You can go and look at Shodan and see, where the vulnerabilities are. Do you think, and we haven't really seen any major critical infrastructure attacks of any I mean, there was the Ukrainian, I think, gas pipeline.
Well, there's the Ukrainian grid, or bits of the Ukrainian grid.
Right. And there was the Gazprom, I think, pipeline went under a cyber attack. They changed the pressure in the valves, caused an explosion.
Where was that?
In Russia.
In Turkey? In Russia?
I thought it was Russia. Anyway, we can check that.
Is this the farewell dossier? Is this the farewell dossier thing with the stolen code from Canada?
I don't know. I'm too rusty on that. But I mean, my point is that you can count on one hand the number of real cyberkinetic attacks that we've seen in my book. Did you know I wrote a book?
I did not.
The Cyber Breach Communication Playbook.
Oh, great.
You've been hacked and it's going public. What to say, what not to say, to whom, when, and how to say it. But we talk about cyberkinetic attack in that book. And the Aurora test at the Idaho National Labs, where they blew up that 80-ton generator.
Yep.
And Wired actually just wrote an article about it last week, just recapping on what that was. But where I'm heading with this, I'm saying, well, in the light of the fact that we've got attack groups within nations that are on some form of covert untouchability or protection, and now we've got more critical infrastructure than ever coming online. We've got still, I would say, fairly tense geopolitical relations between nations, particularly to our north. And I mean, the Australia-China thing is now well known, the sort of brinksmanship around that, and Russia and other nations. I mean, is it just a matter of time before we actually see a real cyberkinetic attack?
Well, we've seen some real ones, and yeah, we will see more. I think the way I used to think that the way this was going to start was, some country already outside the norm, like North Korea, because they don't care, and because, what are you going to retaliate against, that they would do something like that. But where we're actually seeing the development is in already hot zones. So it's been all over the Middle East. For example, there's the Shmoon thing against Saudi Aramco. And Russia repeatedly doing stuff to Ukraine. It was 2 years of blackouts around Christmas. So because the US hasn't, and others have not gone absolutely bats and done something serious in response in those instances, they allowed, that's one of the point of my peer Andy's book about the Ukraine attacks and the Russian unit that was behind it. Because the U.S. the U.S. missed an opportunity to say, okay, that an attack on the grid against an ally is too far, and we're going to do something about it. And the U.S. barely did anything about it, and there were mushy sanctions. They lumped in with a bunch of other stuff at the same time, and they said, like, well, this is about the Ukraine attack and a couple of other things. And it was largely because Trump was in power, and he didn't want to call out the Russians in a significant way. But we missed that opportunity. And so the same skills, the same programs, and the same programmers that were used to attack Ukraine can be used, repurposed to attack the United States or France or Germany or whomever. And I think they will, because it's a lot. It's the retribution is less than if you send a bomber. And there is some, some deniability, plausible or otherwise. And I think it's kind of about creating fear. You still manage to create fear, both economic and sort of life or death in the target areas. So I believe it happened. We don't know when. We don't know where, but yeah, it'll happen.
I mean, there's no doubt the capabilities are there, as you say. And let's be frank, I mean, cyber offensive capability, I think it was who was Howard Schmidt's predecessor and boss? Was it Baker, James Baker?
No, a predecessor in the White House?
You didn't really have one.
Dick Clark.
Was it who wrote the book Cyber? It was Dick Clark.
Richard Clark, yeah.
Richard Clark, yeah. Sorry. And he had said at the time, he'd done a stock take of nations that had a cyber offensive capability, and it was pretty much everybody.
Yeah.
So I mean,
now it's everybody and their dog.
Right. So, well, the dog was on the internet first, remember? But I mean, isn't it always motive and opportunity and capability the real determinants here? And I think, we've got you've got the capability is pretty much established. And I would say almost universal. To a lesser or greater degree, there are hackers in every country that are capable of doing some damage, for sure.
Mm.
Then it's just a question of what would the circumstances be, how would they arise that would be sufficient for a nation to actually go and take that next step, initiate a cyberkinetic action. And then the question is, you've got false flag attacks, attributional issues, and then escalation. So I mean, there are scenarios there that you could conceptualize without too much difficulty. The difficulty is predicting just when and where that might occur, and what the impacts would be. But it does feel to me, Joe, sitting here talking to you, 11 years after that your book came out, that not a lot has changed. As you say, I think in many ways things have got worse. But I always like to steer these discussions towards some glimmer of optimism. Is there anything at all other than what you said a minute ago about maybe nations being more prepared to call out other nations now? Is that where you think the progress is to be made, or where else is it that you see improvement that could be done?
Well, after my book came out, it was, as they say, a wake-up call for many. A lot of the things that I called for in my final chapter have come true, like everything except for like self-reliability, and that's starting to come true. Since the book, there have been lots of other books that have said, we're also screwed in this way, we're screwed in that way, there's the military-industrial complex, that's bad. There's WikiLeaks, and now there's disinformation, there's all these other terrible things. And I waited a long time before writing another book, because I didn't want to say, yes, we're also screwed in some other way, or, you missed this part about how we're screwed. And so I actually began looking for something that was positive, but realistic and sort of actionable. Like, here are some things that are working, and you can too. And that's much harder to do. But I found something. I went back to the earliest still operating US group of hackers, who started out as, teenagers with modems who saw war games and thought that was fun, and, didn't fit in their communities and didn't play sports. And so were willing to spend time, in these horrible, slow modems to try and download a text file, which is all they could handle with their bandwidth. That was a funny story written by some other teenager. And those guys, the ones that stayed in tech and in security, sort of leveled up not only in their skills, but in their morality. And they went off in different directions. The group is the Cult of the Dead Cow. And they were initially famous for having the funniest text files back in the days of bulletin boards. This is mid 80s and late 80s. And then they got famous because they, like, some of the more serious technical minds joined the group because they were funny. Then they saw what was going on once everybody came online with Windows 95, and realized that, you know, the people that they brought on who'd been doing like security advisors for like obscure business software where this has got a flaw and you should fix it. Suddenly they realized that, wow, like everybody's going to be online and Windows is a can of worms. They put TCP/IP in, but they didn't do anything else. And Microsoft was a monopoly and they couldn't move it off the dime. So they basically did a publicity stunt. And at DEF CON in 1998, they announced with great theatricality the release of something called Back Orifice. And they threw CDs with it into the crowd, and then anybody could hack anybody else's Windows box. And, you know, Microsoft played it down. So then they came back again with Back Orifice 2000 the next year at DEF CON. And this one was open source, so that bad guys could just tweak it a little bit and get past the AV. And you could also see that there are no backdoors in it for yourself. And this time Microsoft actually had to get serious. So they moved Microsoft off the dime and did move security ahead a great deal by doing that. Around the same time, they invented hacktivism, which they defined as hacking and security work in service of human rights. And so initially that was about helping people in China evade the Great Firewall and evade censorship. And they worked on their own privacy protecting browser, which didn't take off, but it got enough traction that it forced the Tor guys, they told me, to bundle in a browser into Tor, which is now how everybody uses Tor. So they did things in the, and then these same guys founded a company called At Stake, which was one of the first, you know, hacker boutiques where you go inside a big bank or whatever, and you tell them what they're doing wrong from a hacker's perspective, what they should be doing, as opposed to what all the people in suits have been selling them to convince them to do. And then one of them went to DARPA and launched something called the Cyber Fast Track. And so instead of giving $10 million to IBM or somebody to come up with a secret cyber weapon, they could give $30,000 to the lone hacker in a garage who wanted to do something for the government and had something he thought was kind of cool. And he got to keep the intellectual property from it. So they innovated in government, they innovated in private sector, they formed Veracode, the first serious binary analysis company, and they invented hacktivism. And as luck would have it, as I was reporting this book, which was published a year and a half ago now, one of them ran for president of the United States, and his name's Beto O'Rourke. And he was actually a pretty plausible presidential candidate when the book came out.
What year was that?
The book came out in 2019.
But which election are we talking about? Just the recent one?
The 2020 presidential election, the Democratic primary.
Right.
I knew that was too big to keep. So like actually the day after he declared, before the book came out, I did a big adaptation for Reuters, which is free on the web. You know, with sort of the talking about Beto O'Rourke's history in the group and why that meant something. So not only did we have a hacker running for the White House, we had an early and influential member of the most influential hacking group in US history. And not only that, but he's the guy that gender integrated it. He brought in the first woman to the group, which is a fairly rare thing, especially in those days in the late 80s. So yeah, he committed some crimes. He wrote some gnarly stuff when he was a teenager, which is to his chagrin available online. If now that you know what his handle was, it was Psychedelic Warlord.
Right.
But so that got me some more readers, and has sort of renewed attention in hacktivism and sort of more. And the point of the book was really to have hackers think for themselves about where their moral line is,
Well,
and
that's
maybe
great.
and,
Yeah.
and maybe you want to work for the U.S. military, terrific, or the Russian military, fine.
Mm.
Maybe you want to do nonprofit work, which is a lot easier now to do than it was back in the day.
Right.
Maybe you want to work on tour, something like that in your spare time. Maybe you want to, form a cybersecurity company. That's great too. But to think about it, because I think a lot of people, I mean, the field has exploded since you and I met in Australia 11 years ago. There are probably 3 times as many people in the cybersecurity industry as there were back then.
Mm.
And most of the new entrants don't know any of the history. They don't know why backdoors are bad. They don't know why certain decisions were made.
Mm.
And so by telling the story of this group, the Cult of the Dead Cow, I am hoping, and I know that this has happened, that many people will read this, and it's like a fun way to learn the history and decide what they want to do next. And so there has been this explosion in hacktivism since the book came out. There have been hacktivist attacks on Burmese, outfits that are secretly state-backed in Myanmar that exposed U.S. companies, including Google, doing business with those entities that have changed their policies as a result of those hacking attacks. Much more recently, there have been hacking attacks on right-wing domain hosters and registrars that supported places like Gab and Parler, which are right-wing networks, and briefly the Daily Stormer, a Nazi publication, and stuff like that. So there have been hackers who've been much more engaged politically, which I think is a good thing, because if some folks with technical acumen are going to be engaged politically. So really, if you want your views, Shelley or somebody once said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Hackers are now the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They have tremendous power, and they don't have sort of philosophical training. Most of them didn't go to college, let alone take more than like one required philosophy class. So it is important that they are given the space to think through what they want to do with their powers. And that's what I was hoping to do.
It comes back to what I was sort of trying to put to you before about this bright line of morality. And maybe there's another career for us here, Joe, where we can become the elder, like dinosauric moral philosophers that guide, as you've already started to do with your book, I have to acknowledge. But I'm just thinking there is a moral dimension to this that I think really is unspoken and needs to be more understood.
When I started out to work on this book, I've been covering cybersecurity as at least part of my beat for 20 years. And in some ways that's a disadvantage. There are younger, sprier journalists running around, but I do have like a real good sense of the history of the industry and of hackerdom. And, talking about ethics is not cool. And it struck me as a major absence from the public stage at cons and in papers and stuff like that. So it's what the guys who are really good and have been at this for a while would talk about over beers carefully with people they really trust. The 0-day market. If you're going to sell a 0-day, do you care who it goes to or not? I mean, we're talking about Russians transferring hospitals. There are people right here in America that sell a 0-day to a broker who sells it to another broker who sells it to somebody in Israel that puts it in a product that's used by Saudi or UAE against dissidents and including human rights advocates. Real bad stuff happens. So I wanted to shine a light on that in a friendly way and say things for you to make up your own mind about. Don't just sleepwalk into a safe job at a big company where you do security things without thinking through the implications and the opportunity cost, what you could be doing with your skills and your time.
We could also extend that to the behavioral psychologists that work for social media companies these days.
That's in my book too.
Without
absolutely. So the guy The guy that blew the whistle on Russian disinformation at Facebook a little later than we would have liked is named Alex Stamos. And he had formerly been at Stake, and he had joined at Stake because when he was younger, coming out of Berkeley, his heroes had been in the Cult of the Dead Cow and the Loft, and testified before Congress and told them it's the same guys, and told them that like the internet is, it's held together with Tinker Toys and gum, and any of us could take it down. So I mean there is a through line to the very current fights that are happening now, including inside the media.
I've had some communication with Alex, not very much, but there'll be more happening soon, I think, because of this big announcement we're going to make next week, which I'll clue you in on after this call. But it goes to this question of morality and ethics. And I think I'd like to see, maybe we can use this little video as another thing to add some momentum to this movement that you've started through your book, Cult of the Dead Cow, available from all good booksellers everywhere and on the internet while we still have an internet. Joe, I think you've brought us to as positive a point in this conversation as we're probably going to reach. So I think we should probably cash in our chips right here and sign off. I want to thank you again. I want you to come back to Australia and we can go surf Bondi again, or come down to the South Coast. It'll be a little less crowded.
Sounds fantastic. I would love it.
I'd love to come. I have been to Santa Cruz, but I never had the guts to go into the water because it just looked way too cold. Even the seals were shivering. But anyway, it's great to connect. We should have more of these discussions. I always enjoy talking to you so much and, sharing insights. But I think if anyone hasn't seen Fate, and I tried not to give too much of the plot away here. This book is still in print, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think you should just put a 2 on the end and just put 6 additional pages in the front that basically say nothing's changed except these 2 things and current reading. Joesph Menn, thank you for being my guest and interlocutor. So let's do it again soon.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Good to see you.
Thanks, buddy.
Keep up the good work.